Hello everyone, my name is Diana Ponce. The presentation I will be presenting today will be about racial discrimination in employment. According to scholarly research, as of 1989, there has been little to no change in racial discrimination against African Americans in America. In recent years, we have witnessed several events that regard racial discrimination, one of them being the Black Lives Matter movement during the year 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement is a movement dedicated to advocating racial justice. Like many of you know, this movement caused large peaceful protests all throughout the U.S., as well as riots. According to Mapping Police Violence Organization, in the year 2020, police officers killed a total of 1,127 people. And shockingly enough, 28% were African American. What makes this even more shocking is that African Americans only cover 13.4% of the American population, meaning that 316 of those lives lost were African American in just 1 year. Statistics like these indicate that perhaps racial discrimination is still present in American society. However, many have argued quite the opposite, suggesting that perhaps racial discrimination has decreased due to an increased spread of awareness of racism, specifically in the workforce. Because controversy regarding racial discrimination exists, and it is such a common topic of conversation, I decided to research and figure out if racial discrimination still exists in America today. I did this by researching whether there is racial discrimination in employment. Of course, if the results indicate disparities in the treatment of African Americans and Caucasians during the process of hiring, this would prove that racial discrimination indeed still persists in America. Therefore, investigating its effects on African Americans would also be necessary. Lincoln Killian is a professor at Northwest University. He specializes in sociology and has dedicated his time to researching racial discrimination. He and his colleagues conducted a meta-analysis field experiment in 2017. This meta-analysis would determine if racial discrimination influences the number of callbacks an African American receives after applying for employment. The procedure for this experiment was simple. It required creating resumes for both African American and Caucasian males. The resumes were identical. The only differences were, of course, personal information, such as ethnicity, names, date of birth, and phone numbers. The years of experience and the level of education remained the same for both. The results indicated that Caucasian applicants received a 36% higher number of callbacks compared to African Americans. They conducted this experiment multiple times, and the results were always similar. For that reason, Professor Killian and his colleagues concluded that there had been little to no change in racial discrimination towards African Americans since 1989. Now to discuss some implications of racial discrimination on African Americans. In the short essay, Just Walk On By, Black Men in Public Spaces by Brent Staples, Staples writes of the precautions he feels he must take in order to seem less threatening to those around him. A source similar to the testimony of Brent Staples is the survey conducted by Newsroom. When African Americans were asked if they had experienced incidents of racial discrimination or police mistreatment, 7 out of 10 African Americans answered yes, and over half included that they had felt their lives were in danger at one point or the other. The police mistreatment towards African Americans has caused them to become extremely mindful of their presence in public spaces. A prime example of why this is would be the death of George Floyd. George Floyd was being detained for the alleged use of a counterfeit bill. Former officer Derek Chauvin was seen using excessive force to detain George Floyd. Sadly, because of this mistreatment, George Floyd lost his life. So now to answer some questions. Why are African Americans so mindful of their presence in public spaces? And are African Americans being affected by racial discrimination? Well, like I mentioned on the last slide, African Americans are constantly affected by acts of racial discrimination. The reason why African Americans are so mindful of their presence in public spaces is because they fear that if their actions unintentionally cause anger, fear, or uncertainty in others, just like George Floyd and many other Black Americans, they too could become the next victim of racial discrimination. Sadly, all it takes is one call to the police department from a worried Caucasian person to end a Black life. So when we ask whether racial discrimination still exists in America today, so far all research points to yes. Now I'm going to be discussing some positive achievements for the African American community. A research experiment by Jeremy Sawyer and Anump Gampa could argue that racial discrimination has decreased in recent years. Sawyer and Gampa are social psychologists who specialize in personality and social psychology. Their 2018 research project, Implicit and Explicit Racial Attitudes Changed During Black Lives Matter, proves that during the Black Lives Matter movement, quote, implicit pro-white bias decreased. Similar results were observed for explicit pro-white bias, also during the Black Lives Matter movement. Another source suggesting a decrease in racial discrimination comes from the United States Census. The U.S. Census demonstrates that from 2002 to 2007, Black-owned businesses increased by 60%, which was 3 times higher than the national average rate. And due to this increase, the revenue of these Black-owned businesses increased by 22%. These sources revealed positive achievements for the African American community. Finally, after reviewing and investigating sources, I am able to conclude that racial discrimination is still very prominent in American society. The results from the meta-analysis field experiment by Professor Killian and his colleagues have demonstrated the discrepancies between the treatment of African Americans and Caucasians. While I researched for sources suggesting a decrease of racial discrimination, I had a very hard time finding such sources. Most sources were very outdated, resulting in a very limited number of sources I could use. Through research, I have discovered how heavily racial discrimination affects African Americans. It is difficult to name every way racial discrimination affects African Americans, because there are many underlying factors that contribute to the inequality they experience. I was not able to fully answer how African Americans are affected by racial discrimination because of how complex the question is. To answer this question, a greater variety of research is required. This is all I have for my presentation today. Thank you all for listening, And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. Goodbye.